Um, I decided that for the final prompt, I was going to make this little video of me essentially talking about some of the major themes and things that have resonated with me from our course. Specifically, I'm going to be responding to the first prompt. So I'm going to be talking about Marisol de la Cadena's discussion about partial connections, Sylvia Rivera Cusiconqui's discussion of Chixi and Tepi in Aymara philosophy, and then Gloria Anzaldua's concept of la mestiza, and then border consciousness. So just to sort of ground how I'm gonna structure this, I'm gonna start with talking about the ways these concepts and forms of knowledge relate to each other. And then I'm gonna go into the ways that they represent forms of dissent, which will then carry me into the ways in which they are distinct from the mainstream forms of understanding social difference. And finally, I'm going to talk about aspects of my life that these pieces have shed new light on, specifically Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands piece, because in many ways I am a mestiza. While I am not Hispanic and white, I am actually half Pakistani and half white. So I similarly sort of try to grapple with balancing two identities in my life. And not quite knowing how to sort of exist in both worlds. So I'm going to touch on that towards the end. Yeah, so one of the ways that I think that these texts can really relate to each other is actually through something that we've really talked a lot about in this class, and I think has kind of come up time and time again about the idea of one no and many yeses. And I think that's sort of in reference to how we as people can exist in this world. And they all these texts sort of border on the idea that Western forms of thinking and knowledge rely on the idea that there's sort of one way to exist and one way to truly be in this world. And I think we've seen this many times. I'm thinking specifically of with Escobar and Esteva, when Escobar talked about how development is radically inhospitable because of the fact that we are development only looks at one way of the good life and that there's no plurality to it. It's either like, yes, development is good based on one way of life. And I think a lot of these texts sort of like challenge that idea that like this Western idea, development isn't necessarily related to these texts, but it's just sort of another sort of very Westernized situation with the idea of development relying on the fact that we all have this sort of one almost idea of what a good life is and how to be in this world. And in many ways, that's sort of true. And I think it's because of this very Westernized thought that is sort of like globalized in many ways and kind of trickles down into all these places that says that these are what basic needs are. This is what this is how we live. This is what we want, kind of thinking about a capitalistic society. And so many countries that aren't necessarily the United States or other Western countries want to emulate that because of sort of this idea that these like larger entities have taken over in the ways that we think. And I'm not saying this is universally true. This is just something that kind of has come up. Because I think it would be really naive to say, for example, Latin Americans don't want development, and development defined by sort of that sort of Western idea of coming in and, making everything better and, expanding what basic needs are, all of that stuff, because we very much glorified these Western ideas of thinking. And so it's really inherent in us to think that like to exist here, it needs to be in one way. And so that's why I've really enjoyed learning in this course about the one no and many yeses, because there is a plurality to life. And that's the way that I'm going to talk about how these texts relate. These three women really go against this idea, and I thought it was in such amazing and different ways. So to start, I'm going to talk about Anzaldua's piece. On page 81 of her piece, she says, quote, "La mestiza constantly has to shift out of habitual formations, from convergent thinking, analytical reasoning that tends to use rationality to move forward a single goal, a Western mode, to divergent thinking, characterized by movement away from set patterns and goals toward a more whole perspective, one that includes rather than excludes. And Anzaldúa is touching on just that notion of one no, many yeses in this passage. The idea of many yeses comes in when she calls for a more whole perspective, where rather than many no's and one yes, we can acknowledge the different ways of being. I especially appreciate when she brings up movement away from set patterns and goals, because I think oftentimes part of what makes us not have this sort of plurality is the idea that like we all need to sort of be reaching this one specific goal, like whether it's career oriented, life oriented, how we exist in our society, and that not everyone is going to have those same goals, and that's okay. And we need to shift away from that and just be a little bit more whole-minded in our thoughts. And I think that that's really the way that Anzaldúa sort of exists in this world as a mestiza, and that the way forward into sort of a brighter future for people who don't necessarily identify with what the norm is. In this case, she talks about, being Mexican in this country and being a Chicana woman. How can we include those perspectives? And rather than including them, I think it's a lot more about accepting them and accepting that everyone has a different reality, and thus we can't all fit into this one, set way of living. There are many yeses. And to branch off of this, I want to talk a little bit about Cusicanqui, because she says something similar when talking about her experience as a mestizo, and she explains on page 3 that we are not pure people, and we have to recognize that there's a European stain in our bodies and in our subjectivities. She then explains that there's a contradiction that lies in these two things, but it isn't a bad contradiction, because in the Aymara logic, she explains that it is based in the, quote, included third. A is not B and B is not A, but there are things that are in A and B at the same time. So sort of in binary or more Western logic, one excludes the other. But when you have this logic of inclusion that they have in this Aymara philosophy, you give enormous possibilities of intercultural action. Oftentimes in the Western world, we exclude this opportunity of intercultural action because we shut down and don't accept that there are many ways to be. And so we sort of think of ourselves as separate from other cultures, and that there's not a way for us to necessarily relate almost. I think that in this way, Cusicanqui's piece really relates to Anzaldúa's piece, in thinking of the idea that as a world, especially as a Western world, it's almost confusing for us to think that we could possibly be okay with this contradiction that Cusicanqui brings up, this contradiction of existing in sort of two identities. And similarly, Anzaldúa in her whole book, like that's what the whole thing is just like she's almost going totally against that norm, and she's speaking in Spanish, she's putting in English, she's mixing it up because she's sort of showing through her writing that we can live in this contradiction, and it can be joyful, just like Cusicanqui says. Because we accept that there are many backgrounds and ways to be the right thing. Finally, I want to tie these things to La Cadena and her piece, which is amazing, and I would love to fully read her book at some point. But her idea of partial connections is fully embedded in the one no, many yeses framework that I've been talking about. So I'm just going to include a little passage from her that really stood out to me. So no one has the same life experiences, and thus our ways of knowing, practicing, and making our distinct worlds, our worldings, or ways of making worlds, have been circuited together and shared practices for centuries. However, they had not become one. In the circuit, some practices have become subordinate, of course, but they have not disappeared into those that have become dominant, nor did they merge into a single and simple hybrid. Rather, they have remained distinct, if connected, almost symbiotically so. End quote. Yeah, this quote really struck me when I read it, because we sort of think that, I think in our society and just from living here and just also learning more about Western ideas, I've thought a lot more about how we assume that once our way of life is the dominant way of life, everyone can think that way. And I mean, that goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning with why we think development is good for everyone and that everyone has those same basic needs. But no, even if these ideas become more globally dominant, Cadenas is saying, no, like, that's not actually, like, that doesn't mean that they've become like some hybrid. They're still very distinct and separate ways of being. And unity and coming together doesn't necessarily, diminish the experiences that people bring and their ways of life. Even though we are existing in the same world, she talks about, being circuited together, we don't have to exist in the same way. And there's just a plurality to life. I mean, I think her whole idea of partial connections in general is really interesting because, she's really highlighting the fact that I am never going to fully understand someone's complete experience. Things are going to get lost in translation because we come from different places and we have different realities. And I think this really resonated with me when, in relating it back to Ansel Dua's piece, when Carlos was talking in class about how, as someone who sort of grew up with a lot of the sayings and phrases coming up that Ansel Dua included in the Spanish parts of her book, he was able to really, resonate with those things and really understand what they mean. Well, for me, like, for example, while I've taken Spanish at Bowdoin, I've taken up to advanced Spanish, I could physically translate what Ansel Dua was saying. I was losing so much of the meaning behind it because I didn't grow up in that culture, in that way, in that life. And so as much as I appreciated her work and could appreciate her life stories, I was going to lose something in translation. But a lot of times we don't accept that and we think we have to know everything. But I really like how Cadenas goes against this idea. And similarly, like, obviously with Ansel Dua's book, that's what she's doing. She's, this book wasn't just written for other Chicanas or mestizas. Like, it was written for academia and professors and students. So she knows by writing this, like, things are going to get lost in translation. And Cadenas is telling us, that's okay that, she does that, or that's okay that I'm not going to know everything about your experience and you're not going to know everything about mine, and that our realities are different and we have different ways of existing. We each have a different yes, in a way. And I think we've thought for so long that that's a bad thing, or at least I have, given my upbringing and just growing up in a very westernized world, but it's not. And obviously I don't want to say that these pieces are the same. I know part of the question is to address how they differ. And while they all do talk about this similar theme of one no, many yeses, they do it through different lenses, which I think just sort of highlights their own personal difference in expressing their ideas of plurality and sort of encapsulates the idea of plurality. Ansel Dua's is very centered on the border and expressing identity in the United States, whereas Kusi Konki talks about her indigenous existence in Bolivia and living in contradiction there. And La Cadenas is Peruvian, and she talks about even communicating with other Peruvians and having sort of different experiences, and that was her sort of way of saying that, like, it's okay to have this plurality. And I think the most interesting thing to me is that they all have come to similar conclusions about this importance of plurality, even with their different life experiences. I think they've, come to them differently, but each has experienced grappling with their own forms of fitting into this sort of westernized world, and have come to the conclusion that rather than trying to fit one mold, we rather should understand all of the alternate ways that we can be. And before I transition to talking about myself, something I'm going to sort of use to help me transition is that I think that these texts, or just these women, are forms of dissent in many ways, because their existence in a world that doesn't accept plurality and accept these, very, like, having many worlds and, existing in spaces that aren't necessarily representative or understanding of their backgrounds, is at the heart a form of dissent. And then the fact that they even go as far to speak out about it and, say, well, F that, basically, I'm going to, like, explain why it's better to think of, like, that there can be many yeses in this world. It doesn't, and I am not going to, like, conform to that. And I think that's a really, like, beautiful way to dissent, which sort of ultimately is going to tie into my experience that I just wanted to touch on towards the end here. So I come from two cultures. And I think Ansel Dua's piece really helped me think of it in a sort of different way. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm the daughter of a Pakistani immigrant. That's my mom, and my dad is white. And so I've sort of my whole life just had to sort of deal with this existence of kind of having two cultures. And I've also had a really interesting go with it because of the fact that in many ways, to people on the outside, I can pass for white, especially when I was younger. In school, I was so embarrassed to say that I wasn't just white, just like everyone else, because I grew up in rural New England where obviously the demographic is just largely white people, and I just wanted to be like everyone else, and there wasn't a celebration of other cultures. And this sort of ties into this idea that we sort of have this very direct narrative, very narrow sort of narrative of how we exist in this westernized world. And I think back to when I first year read Ansel Dua's piece and read the You Can't Tame a Wild Tongue chapter. That's chapter 5, which has resonated with me ever since. When she said in school she would speak in Spanish and the teacher would hit her knuckles because it was like, no, you need to speak in English. Like, we are in a place where we speak English. And, she was scolded for it. And I think back to sort of my experience of, I would never have even tried to speak another language. I would never have tried to sort of talk about my culture because it wasn't celebrated. And obviously I don't think my experience would have been as severe as Ansel Dua, given that she was in the 80s and was in a different place. But nonetheless, I still think there is a large level of embarrassment and almost a need for assimilation in our world because of this not really acceptance of plurality. My existence, similar to these women, feels like a form of dissent because I am not one thing and I am multiple yeses at one time. So I think something that I have really struggled with throughout just my life is how I balance these two identities. And I think it's amazing how Ansel Dua says you don't need to balance them almost. You can be both of them at the same time. And that's what she does in her writing. That's why she writes a huge chunk in English, then switches to Spanish and inserts Spanish words into her writing. And it's this very interconnected thing. And I think that's the nature of being a mixed person. And I think back to the time when I was a first year here at Bowdoin, and someone on my floor found out that I wasn't fully white, maybe in December of my first year, and then was like, I don't believe you, show me a picture of your mom. And I showed him a picture and he was like, that's your mom? She's not white. And I was like, yeah, she's not white. I'm not fully white. And I think it's sort of a very interesting way to be of I could assimilate if I want to, and I did for so long, but that's not really necessarily how I want to exist in this world. And I think Ansel Dua is a really interesting role model and gives a really interesting perspective on the nature of being mixed. I mean, another anecdote from my life is my whole life when I was a little kid, I got lost in the grocery store, and I was just with my mom, and someone found me, and and we were walking around looking for my mom, and I went up to and I finally saw her and I was like, oh, that's my mom. And this person didn't believe that was my mom because I was very fair and white as a child, and my mom is a brown woman, and they were hesitant to hand me off to this woman, even though I, as a 4-year-old, am saying that's my mom is coming to get me. And I thought that was there was a lot of disrespect there, and there's a lot of assumptions about my existence and who I am. And I think that that's been a really interesting way to sort of experience life, because I have the option to assimilate and to say that this culture isn't something I want to be part of because of how the way that I look and the way that people can perceive me. But at the same time, that would be such a disservice to the fact that I do have multiple yeses and I do have these experiences, and I live with my Pakistani grandmother, and my parents almost totally went against all norms by getting married. And so I think it's just I think of myself almost as a form of dissent along with these women, because I'm existing in this world as someone who has multiple yeses and someone who is balancing multiple cultures and worlds. I do disidentify in many ways by being here, and I'm proud of my identity. And like Kusikanki says, we should take joy in these contradictions, in this contradiction of my identity, because even if it's confusing to the society that I grew up in, my contradicting identities guide my yeses in this world. So I don't think I necessarily have the skills to write a book like Anzaldua, but I want to keep her in my mind as I continue to exist here and continue to sort of navigate where I go with my life, and make sure that I'm taking with me both backgrounds and I'm not just assimilating in that way, because it was really inspirational to sort of read her piece and know that she was okay sort of shifting between both worlds, and that those both worlds were her one world, and both my worlds ultimately form to be my one world. So that's sort of where I want to ultimately take and guide myself. And finally, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this semester. I'm so grateful to have taken this class and to have taken another class with you, because I think the things that we think about and talk about really help me do a lot of personal reflection, which I don't get in a lot of my other classes. And I really appreciate that. And I appreciate my ability. I really think that this assignment was just made so much stronger by me being able to talk out my life and my experiences, because I do so much writing, but I think it's really powerful to use speaking as a skill. And so I'm really grateful for this assignment. I'm grateful for this class. So thank you so much. And I'll see you next semester. So that's very exciting.